Good morning. Bonjour, buongiorno. So today we began with Domenico Cosmai. He was associate professor of English language and tradition at the University of Bari in Italy, and is currently advisor on cross-cutting institutional issues at the European Economic and Social Committee. He is also a research associate at the Faculty of Letters, Translation and Communication of the University of Bruxelles. He has published numerous publications on the following research areas: institutional multilingualism, multiculturalism, applied linguistics, terminology, and legal translation. We have to mention also two important books about traduction in Europe. The language, one of that book is The Language of Europe. It is in English. And the other one, Tradurre per l'Unione Europea. D'accord. Now I leave him to say.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And good morning, everyone. Thank you, first and foremost. Yes, allow me to thank Fabio, Sonia once again, and all the organizers for hosting this conference and giving me the opportunity to share with you some views based on my professional experience. So, as Sonia said, I have been working for almost 30 years in Brussels in the European Economic and Social Committee, or EESC. So memorize this abbreviation because it will come back quite often in my presentation. And the EESC is one of the two advisory bodies. The other one is the Committee of the Regions, participating in the EU ordinary legislative procedure. So I joined the Italian Translation Service back in 1994. Then I took on various roles in the central administration. And finally, for the last 3 years, I have been serving as a political advisor to the Secretary General, who is the head of our administration. In parallel, throughout these years, I have engaged in academic research on multilingualism and translation practice in the context of the European Union. In this field, the official assumption, the official starting point, is that EU legislative texts are not translated, but drawn up in parallel in all official languages or co-drafted. So this idea is embedded here in the very first regulation enacted by what was then the European Economic Community. This is just Article 1, but of course it goes on. And that was, this is Council Regulation number 1 of 1958, which you can see in the updated version, the latest version, of course, on the use of official languages. Back in 1958, it was just Italian, French, Dutch, and German. So just 4 languages. Now we have 24. Of course, the argument behind the notion of co-drafting, as you can imagine very well, is that the outcome of any legal drafting activity are not derivative texts like translations, but original text, and consequently all language versions of the same piece of EU legislation are authentic or must be authentic from the standpoint of international law. As you can imagine also, even though the contribution of translation to the European decision-making process is not recognized by the doctrine, because here we are talking about a doctrinal approach, in real life, it is impossible to imagine a European Union without translators. And this is what brings about a short circuit between theory and practice. In our daily activity in Brussels, our constant concern is to make sure that EU texts express exactly the same meaning in all language versions, since every language version, and this is the focal point, is not only valid in the country where that language is spoken, but on the whole territory of the European Union. The Maltese version is not valid just in Malta, but all over in the EU. To put it in another way, there is a need for words to make sense in the same way for all EU citizens, irrespective of the language they speak. And this is exactly what I mean in the title by saying all things to all men. So against this very general background, which is, of course, useful for you to understand what comes afterwards, I'd like to present today a case of virtuous complementarity between the political and the administrative levels of the ESC, leading to the latest revision of the ESC rules of procedure. You will see that this exercise exemplifies for me, is a very strange one because it exemplifies for me what is embedded in the title of your conference, because it is at the same time an exercise of translating, writing, and simplifying. We will say that even though simplification is not in the sense that I have been hearing in the other contributions that we have witnessed so far, but you will see what I mean. So the revision of the ESC rules of procedure was a lengthy and complex process which lasted 1 full year between 2021 and 2022. The decision to review the document, this document spells out the mission and all the functioning rules of the institution. The decision was taken in March 2021 by the 329 elected members who compose the plenary assembly of the ESC. The assembly tasked a group of 6 members, the so-called Rules of Procedure panel, with checking the document, setting out from the inconsistencies and the legal gaps that had been detected over the years since the previous comprehensive update back in 2018. Before the Rules of Procedure panel could even start its work, though, it was necessary to identify those items which posed specific implementing and interpretive problems. And this survey was carried out simultaneously at 2 levels: the legal service on the one hand, and all other administrative services on the other hand. The ESC legal service drew up a taxonomy of the legal issues extant in the current rules, ranging from unclear or incomplete provisions, repeated provisions, legal gaps, even inconsistencies with the treaties. There were some they spotted even some of those, and so on. In parallel, so these were the legal issues. In parallel, the rest of the administration, according to their various spheres of responsibility, put forward proposals for changes based on the practical difficulties that they encountered in the day-to-day enforcement. These 2 lists of proposals were ultimately merged and submitted to the political level, who could then launch the revision work. Given the far-reaching implications of this exercise, of course, you have to imagine that the rules of procedure is like the Bible for us. So we apply it on a daily basis, even many times a day. So it was crucial to take an inclusive approach by involving the widest possible number of actors. And in this slide that you can see here, I have endeavored to outline, and I hope it is clear, but I will explain that now, the intricate interaction among the various stakeholders contributing to the review, starting by the necessary distinction between the political and the administrative level. So just to make you understand how this process of drafting, translating, simplifying took place. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have the political level, and this comprises the 3 political groups which make up the ESC. That is the employers group, the group of workers, like trade unions, and what we call the civil society organization groups, which basically comprises all other kinds of NGOs. They designate 2 members each for the Rules of Procedure panel, which is the main actor in this procedure. The designated members for the Rules of Procedure panel are officially appointed by the plenary assembly of the ESC. They hold discussions and take decisions in full autonomy on the possible changes to the Rules of Procedure. The panel is chaired by one of its members, who also has the task of general rapporteur. And then, of course, any other political entities can be consulted or heard by the panel throughout the revision process. For example, political groupings dealing with specific topics like equal opportunities, transparency, and so on, depending on the rules, on the provisions which are under discussion. On the administrative side, the right-hand side, you have a general coordination function, of which I was responsible, with a threefold remit. First of all, managing the secretariat of the Rules of Procedure panel, so making sure that everything goes smoothly in meetings. Then reporting back to the head of the administration, to the Secretary General, and then liaising with all other stakeholders on both the political and the administrative side. Then we have, beside, a legal service with the general responsibility of providing legal counseling and putting forward concrete proposals for changes based on the political decisions that the Rules of Procedure panel takes during its meetings. Then we have a network of contact points stemming each from each directorate of the ESC, legislative works, communication, human resources, etc., in order to provide assistance, if needed, on technical issues related to their sphere of competence. And finally, but certainly not least, the translation service, in charge of translating the new rules into all EU official languages. Now, during the meeting, so I hope you understand, the complex web of interaction between all these actors who participate all in this very complex process. So during the meetings of the Rules of Procedure panel, what did the members do? The members went through the 118 rules of the Rules of Procedure one by one, discussing the various changes proposed by the legal service on the one hand and by the rest of the administration on the other hand. The panel worked in 4 languages, mainly corresponding to the mother tongues of the panel's members, French, German, and Italian, with English as a common vehicular language. The meetings were conducted mostly in English, but occasionally also in other working languages, since we had interpreters in the room. And this is something that you always have to take into account when thinking about how the European Union institutions work. We never work with just one language. We always have to think, how many languages will I have to foresee in order to get things going? In this case, there were just 4, but might have been many more. All the changes agreed at the end of the meeting, of each meeting, by the Rules of Procedure panel were incorporated into an updated, consolidated text and sent every time in its updated version for translation. And it is exactly at this stage that linguists had the possibility to intervene in the political process. The dialogue was launched when translators asked the coordination service to confirm or clarify any element of the source text on which they had doubts during the translation process. These kind of comments are particularly welcome, and there is a general recognition that translators are the first critical readers of our documents, and this is all the more undisputable for a legal text like this, which eventually will have to be enforced and interpreted on a daily basis, as I was saying. So translators provide a kind of ex-ante litmus test on the clarity of the regulation itself, in that they raise awareness on any potential error or risk of misunderstanding in the text. Indeed, as we will see, most of their remarks turn to be relevant and will be used to produce improved versions of the same document. The dialogue with translators works in a very simple way. When translators enter comments or questions on the dedicated platform that you can see on this slide, the email message is sent. An email message is sent to the requesting service. In this case, it was the coordination function, which answers directly. When, however, the question deals with complex legal issues, then the coordination may turn to advice for advice either to the legal service or, if necessary, to the representatives of the directorates in charge of that topic for a technical answer. So it can be said that in this case, simplification takes place at the level of both source and target text, and occurs simultaneously with the process of translating and legal writing. This is why I say that this is writing about translating and about simplifying at the same time. And finally, What it is also important to point out is that the nature of translation, of dialogue with translators, is necessarily bidirectional, because it may occur that in a meeting where participants work on the basis of different language versions, a discrepancy is found between two or more languages. In that case, the coordinating service may be instructed to report the discrepancy to the language versions, to the language services, in order to have it corrected or aligned to a specific language version. For example, please align it to the English version or to the French version, which seems to be the most correct one. So I have attempted to break the most typical issues raised by translators down into 4 categories, broadly corresponding to 4 levels of expertise. Proofreading, which is the lowest, let's say, and then moving upwards, grammar and terminology, linguistic counseling, and legal issues. Proofreading is the most basic level of error checking, and this is mainly about spotting minor oversights, which, however, might result in major blunders should the text be published as such. In this slide, I have selected just a few of the main examples of this basic level of intervention, and what you can see here are the actual questions put by translators. It can be a matter of typos. In Rule 38, should the wording "a group of 25 members" be replaced with "a group or 25 members doing something"? The wording "group of 25 members" was correct, but the doubt was absolutely legitimate. It might be also a matter of formatting. Rule 75, why is the word assembly in bold? Does it have to be, as it is the only one in the entire document? No, it didn't have to be. But it was an oversight. It was rectified. It might be a matter of spelling. You changed the words organization to organization with a Z or Z. In fact, the spelling with Z corresponds to the American standard. Well spotted. It was changed. Repetitions. In Rule 1.5, the first and the second sentences are almost identical now. Nobody had realized that, nobody had seen that, but translators did, and the text was corrected in the process. Moving to a higher level of linguistic expertise, we can find comments on grammar and terminology. The first comment is on grammar, is the result of some grammar check. After the expiry of the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty, the European Commission tasked the European Economic and Social Committee to take over the acquis and the resources of the former. Shouldn't it be of the Consultative Committee of the ECSC, of the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty? Translators were right, of course, because the word former doesn't refer to the committee. But you have to imagine that the revision work is done by bits and pieces which are incorporated in the text. So sometimes you see the tree, but you don't see the forest around. And this is where translators' work is absolutely important. Might be a matter of terminology. Please pay attention to the title of Rule 87, because it's written Article 87, and they were right, because in the context of the rules of procedure, we don't speak of articles, but we speak of rules. So it was corrected as well. It might be a matter of interlingual consistency. We have a sentence in French here. We were discussing about that with Fabio yesterday. La présidence élargie doit de se prononcer, le cas échéant, sur la nomination des fonctionnaires. But in the different linguistic versions finished, this was the remark of the translator, there are 2 diverging interpretations of the French verb se prononcer, because se prononcer in French might mean to take a decision, je me prononce sur quelque chose, or also in the sense of giving an opinion or something. So what are we talking about? Are they just consulting, or do they decide? It was extremely important, and the right meaning was the second one, the fact that they were consulted. Se prononcer, in this case, was donner un avis, to give an opinion on something. The third level is linguistic counseling. An interesting example of the leeway translators can enjoy in defining the formal characteristics of a legal text is the discussion on the use of inclusive language. At the beginning of this revision exercise, the political level had insisted on the egalitarian use of masculine and feminine in the text, instead of limiting the wording to the masculine gender, as had been the case up to then. So let's put masculine and feminine forms in the same text. So this request, of course, doesn't pose any problem in English for the English language, because English has its own strategies to neutralize the vocabulary. We say chair instead of chairman. We say they instead of he or she. We can say president, and this means a he president and or a she president. But in grammatical gender languages like Italian, French, or German, the co-occurrence of masculine and feminine forms can easily result in long-winded, at times almost indecipherable wordings. And we have to remember that 18 out of 24 EU official languages work exactly in this way. So this is why all EU institutions have eventually opted for the use of the generic masculine in legal texts, sometimes highlighting in an explicit way that the use of the masculine form was not intended to exclude and did not exclude the feminine gender. So the European Economic and Social Committee and its half-brother Committee of the Regions have common official guidelines on the use of inclusive language in written communication, according to which, so it's not like an intransigent view for all kinds of text, but what our common guidelines on inclusive language say, there is a quotation that you can see on the screen, the use of the generic masculine cannot be completely avoided in legal texts or in some legal texts for reasons of clarity, comparability with possible other language versions, and legal certainty. It was the Directorate of Translation, which is led by two women, actually, who finally persuaded the political level on the need to avoid the co-occurrence of masculine and feminine forms, lest the sentences become too cumbersome, and to add instead a general statement at the very beginning of the document, specifying that the masculine form, in this case, always includes all genders. And then we find the highest level. We have remarks verging on legal issues, or remarks where the boundary between the linguistic and the legal element is blurred. We have, for example, matters dealing with legal discourse. Sections may seek the approval of the committee bureau by written procedure. So the translator asks, with the addition of may, the provision now seems to become more optional. Could you please advise which part has become non-obligatory? The search of the approval itself or the use of the written procedure? The answer was the search of the approval, but the question was appropriate nonetheless. Sometimes the attention is even drawn to procedural inconsistencies, like for example, in the last example I have, in Article 40.1, there are the expressions list presented by the election panel or election panel's proposals. And then the translator points out to the fact that these expressions are no longer entirely correct, since the election panel, which is a sort of commission working in order to prepare the elections, no longer draws up the list in question according to the new rules. That is, the rules that had just been modified. It is the political groups that prepare it. So the election panel limits itself to presenting all the lists to the assembly for the vote. So translators were once again right, and these sentences had to be modified. I move to conclusions. I would like, by way of conclusion, 1 minute is fine. I would just like to refer to the notion of hybrid text, which was introduced some 20 years ago by scholars like Trosborg, Scheffner, Adab, and a few others in relation to the drafting of EU political text. According to Trosborg, in particular, when we talk of hybrid texts in the context of the European Union, we refer to the fact that EU legal texts tend to become standardized and simplified, streamlined in both structure and vocabulary, since the translation process is neither source-oriented nor target-oriented, but rather neutral across 24 languages. This is a very interesting starting point for this kind of reflection. But what, however, and this is my suggestion to you, since you are, most of you are part of the academia, but what academic studies may have overlooked so far, and this is the point I have been trying to make with my presentation, is a fuller appreciation of the role of the translation service themselves in the drafting of EU legal text. This role, as we have seen from the examples before, is played not only through the interaction with the various administrative services coordinating the process, but can also take place indirectly, sometimes even directly, as we have seen for the linguistic counseling example, by persuading the political body in charge of the drafting. So this recognition might be the starting point for a new strand of research on the translation of EU institutional discourse, because it would help highlight the translators' active contribution in a context where they are still considered as mere end receivers of source texts. Thank you very much.
Perfectly on time. Perhaps when we work in Brussels, you are happy to be on time, or I don't know. Thank you also for your explanation about the difficulties that we have to translate in Europe. So we can wait. We can see if there is some question in the audience.
Also in French, if you want.
Oui, alors, si je peux, je vais poser ma question. C'est même pas une question. Alors, il y a une partie question qui n'a pas grand-chose à voir avec tout ce que tout ce que tu nous as raconté et qui concerne plutôt les procédures de réalisation des textes et je vais y revenir. Mais je voulais avant tout te remercier vraiment pour nous avoir montré à quel point l'agentivité des traducteurs est là tout le temps lorsqu'il est question de traduction. C'est-à-dire vraiment, comme tu le disais justement à la fin de ton intervention, on pourrait avoir l'impression que le travail d'un traducteur est un travail globalement passif, alors que elles ont un rôle incroyable. Ils sont vraiment des co-réalisateurs des textes et des améliorateurs sous infini point de vue du texte. Donc, c'est vraiment très intéressant. Ma question voulait revenir sur la co-officialité, on va dire, je sais que ce n'est pas le bon mot, des différentes versions. Et donc, le fait qu'il n'existe pas de traduction, mais que des originaux. Et donc, est-ce que les textes sont traités à l'avance, avant de passer à la traduction, de façon à éviter le plus possible des ambiguïtés ou des formulations qui pourraient se prêter à des versions différentes dans les différentes langues? Ou bien c'est un travail qui est fait en quelque sorte après coup, une fois que les traducteurs ont traduit et ont évalué la qualité des textes?
Oui, merci Fabio, c'est très clair. Alors tout d'abord, je voulais dire quelque chose concernant la première partie de ton intervention. Le fait que, moi je ne dirais pas que les traducteurs ont un rôle passif ou actif. Moi je dirais plutôt qu'ils sont, non seulement ils ont un rôle réactif, mais aussi un rôle proactif. Hein, et aussi, ajouter que ce que j'ai essayé de montrer, c'est que très souvent, dans un cas comme celui-ci, ils sont associés à la réalisation du texte. Ils sont associés, ils ne sont pas des co-réalisateurs du texte, parce que bien évidemment, le texte est le résultat de discussions politiques, mais ils sont associés. Ils sont associés depuis le début. Et je pense que ça, c'est quelque chose de très important. Alors, concernant ta question sur le editing ou sur la vérification, disons, d'un texte, ça peut arriver à plusieurs moments en fonction des circonstances. C'est-à-dire, si un texte est écrit en anglais, typiquement, par quelqu'un qui n'est pas de langue maternelle anglaise et que cette personne, le rédacteur, ne se sent pas sûr de son anglais, alors là, on pourrait imaginer qu'on l'envoie d'abord au service de editing, on le fait contrôler. Je peux vous assurer que les collègues anglophones sont très pointilleux en matière de contrôle, de vérification linguistique, et seulement après, il est envoyé en traduction. Donc, editing, traduction. Parfois, il peut aussi arriver que le editing se fasse au milieu du processus, comme dans ce cas, parce que parfois, il y avait des morceaux de texte qui devaient être contrôlés d'abord par les traducteurs. Donc, c'était disons, l'editing, c'était à l'intérieur du processus de traduction, mais ça peut arriver aussi, et ça arrive, par exemple, dans ce cas aussi, qu'à la fin de tout le processus, hein, encore une fois, on est renvoyé au service de traduction pour dire, bon, écoutez, maintenant, vous avez le texte définitif, alors là, il faut que vous procédiez à un editing le plus correct possible, une vérification linguistique. On l'a fait pour, aussi bien dans ce cas pour l'anglais et pour le français, puisqu'il y avait aussi des morceaux de texte qui avaient été élaborés en français directement. Et une fois que tout ça a été vérifié avec le concours du service juridique, parce que le service juridique parfois n'était pas d'accord sur certaines propositions de service de traduction. Donc c'était vraiment un processus très long. Et seulement après ça, on a considéré qu'on avait un texte définitif qu'on pouvait envoyer au journal officiel pour publication, parce qu'il ne faut jamais oublier que ce texte-ci a été publié au journal officiel.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask a question on the gender-sensitive language issue, because I just was wondering, in terms of the discussion which is going around about this gender-sensitive language, is there any, I don't know, is there a perspective that it will change to use gender-sensitive language? Because if I can be very honest, I don't get why it's not why it can hamper clarity, because, for example, for German or even French, there is a way to gender. And if I say la présidente avec un point, I don't know why it's less or more clear. And also there are studies that show even if you say you don't want to exclude female, they are always excluded. So that I was just wondering if there's an idea to change that maybe, because I think it's kind of sad. Sorry, it was very honest.
No, wait. Yeah, it's on. No, I mean, of course, it's sad in a way, and I do share your viewpoint. So you have to consider two things. First of all, this was a pragmatic solution that was adopted in this case, and also consider that the previous version had exactly what you had. I mean, the various slashes, but in certain language versions, like the ones with the declensions, it made the whole reading of the text very, very difficult. So this time it was adopted like that. But the reflection is ongoing. The reflection is ongoing. I mean, we don't take anything for granted, and you might bump into text, into EU text, which still have this double occurrence of masculine and feminine. So it's I don't think that we can say that EU institutions have a just one fit for all approach. No, the reflection is ongoing, and of course, I can assure you that this is something we devote the utmost attention to. Also, because I think that in institutional discourse everywhere in Europe or in the Western world, the reflection is ongoing. No one has the right answers. So what we do, we are following this reflection, and each language service, the English, the French, the German, and all the others are following that reasoning, that line of reasoning, also for the language that they deal with. So it's, but sometimes you have to find an indifferentiated approach, just one approach for 24 languages. And this is why sometimes you get to a common denominator. This is something that you also find in another context, in terminology used. We were talking about that with Sonia yesterday. Sometimes you find an abundance of hypernyms in EU discourse, simply because you cannot refer to things that are, I mean, if you had to translate frico into Lithuanian or Latvian, etc., you would have to find a way. So the right way is to keep it to the general, to try and be as general as you can. And this is, I mean, the result of having to deal with 24 EU languages with different cultures, different habits at the same time. I hope this replies to your concern.
I'm sorry, very quickly, because
Thank you very much. I will be very quick.
Yeah.
I just want to follow up on what Julia said, and perhaps make the case perhaps more problematic for some people. But if there needs to be a common denominator, has anyone ever proposed to have the feminine denominator? Because some people on an individual basis, when they write academic articles, I read sometimes academic articles by colleagues who take the feminine case as a common denominator, which has a sort of alienating effect even on women readers like myself. And I know it seems a bridge too far for many people, but it might be, I was just wondering whether no one has ever suggested it yet in any of the bodies.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I don't remember having seen any EU official text with the feminine form as a common denominator. This I have to be honest. I don't remember anything of that. But please. Yes, yes, of course. It has been mentioned, because, as I say, the reflection is ongoing, and there is a good deal of attention devoted to also this kind of empowerment, also from the linguistic standpoint. This is something which is extremely important for the EU institutions. So, of course, this debate has proceeded for a long time with quite a few proposals. But what I can say is that what I can see so far is solutions adopted on a pragmatic basis, on a case-by-case basis, without a common approach. But this is not to rule out that this will not come in the future. I mean, the reflection is still, the jury is still out.